I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to our Brooklyn Greenway Initiative 2024 State of Brooklyn Greenways presentation. I will be joined tonight by Rob Pirani, founding chair of Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, and currently with the Hudson River Foundation, Jon Orcutt, advocacy director at Bike New York, and Brian Hedden, Greenway projects and advocacy coordinator at Brooklyn Greenway Initiative. So this provides an overview of what we will be talking about tonight. We'll be telling you all the updates on progress on the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, updates on Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, as well as plans for other greenways across Brooklyn. And we'll also have an opportunity for your questions as part of this presentation. So first, you may be wondering, what is the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway? Well, this shows an aerial photograph of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. And as you can see from this photo, it spans the entire Brooklyn waterfront. It's a 29-mile corridor. We have an incorrect number on this slide, but keep 29 miles in mind. And 21 of those miles have been completed for safe access for cyclists, runners, pedestrians, and other forms of non-motorized transit, people out for recreational runs, commuting to work, making deliveries. So the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway stretches from Greenpoint all along the waterfront to Shirley Chisholm Park in East New York at the Queens border on Jamaica Bay. So we'll be getting into a lot more detail about this and plans to fill in those 8 miles of gaps throughout this presentation. A little bit of the origin of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and Brooklyn Greenway Initiative. This program, this initiative, this Greenway that hopefully all of us use and enjoy, was started with a vision of Brooklyn residents over 20 years ago who wanted better access to the Brooklyn waterfront and also wanted safe passage for cycling and running and walking all along the waterfront. So that group created Brooklyn Greenway Initiative. We are a nonprofit organization, fully independent, but working in partnership with the City of New York and advocacy organizations, urban planning organizations, and individuals all across Brooklyn and across New York City. This slide gives an overview of Brooklyn Greenway Initiative's major focuses going into 2024. Our advocacy, continued advocacy, and public engagement to build excitement and support for the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. Later in this presentation, you'll be finding out more about some of our upcoming events. So you can come out and meet us on the Greenway and go for a bike ride or participate in a volunteer activity. We are also conducting a major research study of who's using the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. We have 32 sensors along the 29-mile corridor that are counting usage 24/7 and are able to determine if someone's using a bike or running. So we're super excited. In 2024, we'll be completing the study and releasing the results in this fall. So stay tuned for more information about our Greenway user study. Really, I think one of the first of its kind in the United States and certainly in New York. Brooklyn Greenway Initiative also created a green space on the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, the Naval Cemetery landscape. So we developed the vision for that space and we fully operate it and program it. So throughout the summer and fall months, we'll be having public programs there, and definitely hope you'll come by and enjoy it for one of our programs, or just at any of the times that our staff is there managing the Naval Cemetery landscape. And that is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, adjacent to Clinton Hill, Wallabout, and Williamsburg. And we also convene and lead the New York City Greenways Coalition, which is a group of 45 plus Greenway organizations that are advocating for greenways across New York City. So we all decided that we have shared interests, and there is strength in numbers to advance greenways across New York City. And I would say coming up, and something you'll learn more about in this presentation, is plans for additional greenways in Brooklyn and how you can participate and give your feedback about what you'd like to see in a greenway. So we have a couple of slides of the Naval Cemetery landscape just to entice you to visit this. So please stop by. This shows its relationship to the Greenway, just right beside it, but certainly feels like a place apart. So we have declared 2024 the year of New York City Greenways, and that's because there is so much happening in greenways this year. So starting off our 20th anniversary, as I mentioned, really looking to build enthusiasm around that. The completion of the citywide greenways plan this December. We'll be talking about more about that in this presentation. And also the kickoff of planning for 40 new Greenway miles plus upgraded Greenway miles, which are actually in Brooklyn. So you'll see on this map, which we're talking about more later in the presentation, where these 60 miles of greenways are located. And this will be a public engagement process that we hope you'll participate in and spread the word if you know people who are interested in greenways or live adjacent to one of these corridors or ride them frequently. And then also another big milestone that we're excited about this year is the release of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway user study. And so I think with that, we'll hand things over to Rob Pirani, who will be giving a bit of the history of Brooklyn Greenway Initiative. Thank you, Rob.
Well, thank you, Hunter. As you noted, it's really a milestone year for the Greenway and Brooklyn Greenway Initiative. 20 years ago, we incorporated as a 501c3 with a mission to advocate for the construction of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and to expand greenways throughout New York City. You're going to hear from Jon Orcutt and Brian Henn in a minute on some of the current details and where the Greenway is at and where the Greenway Coalition is at. And I guess I've reached that stage in my career where I'm sort of looking backwards and providing some history to all the advocates and planners and Greenway aficionados on the call. So, hope you'll, please join me in kind of taking a little trip down memory lane. And, hopefully, some lessons that we can all learn from as we go forward with advocating for greenways. So roughly 25 years ago, the Greenway Initiative was really started by a group of 3 neighbors from the Columbia Street waterfront neighborhood, Milton Puryear, Brian McCormick, and Meg Fallereth. And, like most green space initiatives in New York and elsewhere, the Greenway Initiative kind of grew out of a combination of that community-led vision and spunk, and then the willingness and dedication of some key public officials and agency staff to kind of respond to those that community vision. So Milton, Brian, and Meg came together at first really to rally against a New York City DOT proposal to add a dedicated truck lane to Columbia Street between Atlantic and Hamilton Avenue. It was a proposal that DOT kind of had in its capital planning bank from, I would say, the early 1960s, where they saw the Red Hook terminal expanding and the need to get trucks in and out of the terminal more quickly as a real important solution. And so obviously, Milton, Brian, and Meg were concerned that road expansion, aside from the truck traffic it would bring, would really kind of run counter to what they saw as the need, which was a landscape pathway that was safe for kids to walk and ride their bikes. And they were sort of picking up on a 1990 plan that was developed by Holly Happ at City Planning to create a waterfront pathway from Atlantic Avenue down to Red Hook. But they had the genius idea that for their vision to succeed and for their neighborhoods to succeed, they needed to look beyond their neighborhoods and beyond those few miles to the full 14 and now 29-mile Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. That, you know, it wasn't just about their neighborhood, it was about all the neighbors and all the neighborhoods in Brooklyn coming together and demanding access to their waterfront and demanding a safe way to walk or pedal to that waterfront. I personally was really fortunate to get involved and meet the three of them, you know, roughly in 2000. And I worked with them to undertake a series of community-led planning studies, starting with getting the Port Authority and the Red Hook Terminal to drop their plans and instead dedicate the space to a bike route we now enjoy south of Atlantic Avenue. And along that way, and then that led to community planning charrettes throughout the Brooklyn Waterfront and Sunset Park, in you know, the Columbia Street neighborhood in Dumbo, in Greenpoint and Williamsburg. And then, you know, with the help of some elected officials and agency staff, we then moved to it becoming an official city document. I just want to call out Borough President Marty Markowitz and Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, who you can see here, along with her key staff, Dan Wiley, who really led us to get some federal funding that made the project real. Chris Ward at the Port Authority, who sort of decided that giving up the space for the bike and walking path was the right thing to do. Andrew Kimball, who did the same thing when he was at the Navy Yard and provided space not just for the bike path along Flushing and Navy and Williamsburg Street, but also for the Naval Cemetery landscape. And not least, Mr. Jon Orcutt, who formerly was now at Department of Transportation, now with Bike New York. So with that little, you know, thanks for indulging me on that little bit of history, and let me pass the baton over to Jon.
Thanks, Rob. In 2007, I went to work at the Department of Transportation. And that was a time when at DOT, we were really starting to do new things. We created the idea of protected bike lanes. We started to repurpose surplus parts of the street system into plazas and other public spaces. We created the Select Bus program along with the MTA. And, you know, we were out there talking to people like Rob and Milton who were, you know, trying to figure out something to do. And one of the things that we found, sort of a new group of us who came into DOT in 2007, was that Congresswoman Velázquez had allocated and secured $14 million of funding for doing something more on the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. The piece along Columbia Street that Rob's been describing was kind of lonely. It was this nice bike path, but it ended, you know, pretty, you covered it on a bike pretty fast. And, you know, the BGI had a vision for a much further extended, you know, situation along the waterfront. And around the time we were sort of digging into this, you know, we were doing bike lanes, hundreds of miles of bike lanes in a couple of years as part of the mayor's sustainability program. And one of those was on Kent Avenue in the north side of Williamsburg, where we were developing a two-way version of the new parking protected bike lane template. And so that went in 2010, and that sort of gave a lot of life to the idea that we should be connecting things up along the Brooklyn waterfront. So what we decided to do, and we sat down with the Congresswoman and Dan Wiley, you know, who's still on the job as a key aide for the Congresswoman. And we said, look, $14 million isn't going to go too far along the waterfront. But the problem we're facing here is defining pieces of this and putting them into motion and figuring out, you know, how that's going to work. So let's take the $14 million and create a plan for the whole corridor. And that will then create the mechanism for creating the scope for individual projects that we can then put into the capital program. They're going to cost more than $14 million in a lot of cases. But what we'll do is we'll have a framework so that we can build the thing out over time. And that has actually really worked. And the Congresswoman said, just use the freaking money. And so that was great. So we had her on board. BGI was really into it. And we were able to bring good consultants in. And this is what you're looking at is a page from the plan. And it really did work. So and the plan was published in 2012, 12 years ago. And so what you see now along the Brooklyn waterfront is there are fruits of this plan sort of emerging. And what the plan enabled was the scope to be developed for the Flushing Avenue section of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, a scope to be developed for the Kent Avenue South piece of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, which was recently built along that side of the Navy Yard. Scope to be developed for that portion of Second Avenue down near Sunset Park that connects down into Owl's Head Park. So we're actually building this thing out. So a few lessons from the plan that we're finding is, that model does work. If you create that action plan, it creates that framework where you can create city capital projects and then build pieces of Greenway. And the beauty of that is that the city's replicated it in a few places. There's a similar thing for the Jamaica Bay Greenway, where DOT keeps adding perpendicular pieces to the Shore Parkway bikeway down there, which are working really well, and which over time will add up to a much more connected system in southern Brooklyn. And now the city has those new studies that are starting that Hunter showed initially in 5 or 6 different corridors, where we're going to be able to rehabilitate or add new alignments for greenways all over the city in places that will then start to add up to much more of a broad citywide network. Couple other things that the plan shows too, though, is that New York City's public construction program is just way too small for what we want to see in New York. And it's not just greenways, it's plazas, it's sidewalks, it's everything. But 12 years later, we're still trying to get a lot of these pieces started. The Kent Avenue bike lane, which is just paint and a parking regulation, that thing is now 14 years old, and it really hasn't changed in that time. The whole idea of a parking protected bike lane was created, initially in 2007 by us as a way to try some stuff. And it's become kind of the default application for the city DOT to create better bike lanes. But I don't know that we ever really intended it to sit around as paint for 15 years. We really should be building some things. So if you recognize this cross section that we have here on the screen, this is Franklin Street between Greenpoint and Williamsburg along Bushwick Inlet. And we do not have the vegetated buffer, even though we do now have a protected bike lane here. We have some parking protected sections. We have some Jersey barrier protected sections, things DOT can do very quickly. But we have not built it in this nice way that the plan shows. We have not even started to think about how to do this in the north side of Williamsburg, where Kent Avenue has changed unbelievably in the 12 years or 14 years since the protected bike lane was added. We're still trying to figure out, how do you connect that stub of a greenway down on 2nd Avenue up into Red Hook? We haven't really defined those projects, even though the framework is there for the city to do that. So my view is, one of the things we need going forward is a lot more pressure for construction and a bigger construction program for safe streets and the kind of linear parks that greenways represent. Because we're going to have even more plans going forward that we need to plug more and more projects into. So we're going to need pressure from all of you to think much bigger in terms of public construction in the city for these things, so that we're not just looking at paint for the next 15 years on some of these corridors. And the city has done a nice job in some places with paint. Emmons Avenue is a new piece of the Waterfront Greenway, but let's build it at some point, and let's not be content with where we are with plastic and paint as the defining way to do these things. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more of these kind of cool framework plans underway now. And so we have to think about, how do we really get the big bucks to build these things for the future of our city?
Well, thank you so much, Jon and Rob and Hunter, for kicking us off. We'd love to take a few minutes now to see if anybody in the Zoom room has any questions. Someone just posted a question in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and read that question and pose that to our panelists. And then Brian will continue the presentation. So if you have any questions for Rob or Hunter or John in particular, feel free to put them in the Q&A section now, and I can start going through them. So we'll start now with a question from Edmundo. A question for those who were involved back then. What was something that was successful then that we aren't doing now? Great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. You know, and I don't think this is really a secret to Ed or you know, the many other activists I see who are on the call. But you know, again, to me, it's always the way that these initiatives work is that combination of vision, where you know people kind of can you know inspire folks and get them to see beyond sort of the you know, the being against something or beyond sort of their immediate need. And then finding, you know, a lot of times money to make it real. You know, I think, you know, John hit the nail on the head. You know, Milton and I would go talk to people and nobody really took us that seriously till Nydia and Dan secured $14 million. Then all of a sudden, you know, it was like, oh, this is actually a project. So you know, again, not saying anything other folks don't already know, but that to me is always the recipe for success.
I think one of the things that's different is that we don't often get mayors in New York who care about the physical city. And I'd say Bloomberg was sort of partway there. He wasn't naturally supportive of all this stuff like public space and bus lanes and bike lanes himself, but he understood it once you explained it to him, and he said, if you can make it work and it's going to be better for safety and we'll have more options. And he had he hired a lot of people who were really interested in it. And he was interested in the idea that other cities were leaving us behind around the world who were doing it. But de Blasio was not like that. He didn't think about this physical city, and Eric Adams is not like that either. So I think we need to demand more from future leaderships of the city about what is the city going to look like physically. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not just because, you know, cars and trucks are more out of control than ever before. And so we're physically getting run over a lot, but also because of climate change. Like, we really need to think about the physical city. And it's really not part of the Adams administration's agenda.
We've got another question. Where are the upland connectors to the present and proposed greenways?
Yeah, so
Jamaica Bay plan that I talked about is pretty much all about upland connectors, and there's a series of you know greenway connections or protected bike lane connections that are kind of perpendicular to the Shore Parkway that are starting to develop, you know, those sort of linkages into the neighborhoods from the greenway. You know, we have now the Navy and Ashland protected bike lanes, which do that in the vicinity of the Navy Yard and the Manhattan Bridge. We need more, though, when you start to get around over to the Red Hook side and to the Sunset Park side. You know, it's a good question for the city DOT and the street plan.
Yeah, and let me just echo that, and you know, in particular, you know, and maybe give a shout out to Uprose, who really pushed for trying to get upland connectors in the Sunset Park neighborhood, and obviously hasn't always been realized, but something that you know really makes you know the Greenway, a waterfront Greenway, work, is being able to you know make sure that neighbors in those upland communities can get down to the waterfront and the attractions that are being created there, including the Greenway.
And you know, there is a Greenway rehabilitation plan for Leif Ericson Park, which connects out towards the southern end of the Waterfront Greenway at 2nd Avenue and then into Owl's Head Park, and will connect up to the 4th Avenue bike lane. So that's, you know, but between like there and, you know, Brooklyn Bridge Park, we need more of them.
We've got two more questions here, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. So we'll go ahead and answer these two, and then I'll kick it off to Brian, and then we'll come back to questions after these two. So our next question is, Jon said that paint was just an experiment back in 2007. Does an ideal bike lane exist in New York City, and which one is it? Or is there one in another city that we could look at on the web?
There's so many bike lanes in my brain. I don't know which one is the ideal one, but look, what I would like to see is when we're rebuilding a street, that we don't just rely on people's good parking skills to define the bike lane. I would like to see curbs between the parking lane and the bike lane. We should have curbs. That was promised in the Waterfront Greenway plan on Kent Avenue, for example, which has become very, very chaotic with, the vast increase in bike traffic, but also the vast increase in foot traffic and the incredible density that's been built there since the bike lane went in. So I just think everything needs to be much more physical than it is in our bike network today. And greenways are supposed to be physical manifestations of that. But but in a lot of cases, we're still calling paint greenways.
And let me just add that I think, one other aspect is, have the green, right, in the greenway. And, certainly, vegetated landscaping, in addition to providing that extra safety for bikes and peds is something that communities, enjoy and, provides all kinds of ecosystem services, or at least has the potential to do so. And I think that's something that to me makes up an ideal greenway. We can't always, it is New York City. We don't always have the space to get everything we want. But that when we have a vision, that's what it should include. And hopefully not stealing some thunder from Brian Hedden. But one of the things I think we're looking for out of the citywide Greenway plan is a city definition of greenways that, sort of holds up that idealized vision.
And for our last question for this segment, so if you have more questions, get ready to ask them in a bit. We have appreciate all of your efforts for our community. Out of curiosity, whose responsibility is it to clean and landscape the Greenway? I live across the street from Building 77 at the Navy Yard, and there's always a lot of garbage on the Greenway.
Sounds like a question for Brooklyn Greenway staff.
Well, I would say, it's obviously the landowner's responsibility to maintain their property. And in the case of greenways, it's a challenge because as we know, one of the great things about greenways is that it connects across all kinds of public and in some cases private property. Brooklyn Greenway Initiative has, taken on some of that stewardship responsibility, but, we're not a city agency, right? We are not taxpayer supported. And at the end of the day, maintenance of public space really needs to be a city responsibility and specifically whatever agency, whether it's DOT or the Navy Yard, whose property the Greenway is on.
I mean, last summer when the Greenway got really overgrown around Kent Avenue and Flushing, City DOT came out and, hired somebody to come out and trim the plants back. Sanitation plows those sections when there's snow, so they are public rights of way. So in terms of street cleaning, it's probably sanitation.
I can come back to that one too. When we get into it, there's a little bit on the overall maintenance of the greenways that includes right of way and landscape and snow maintenance. So I can come back to that question specifically when we get to that point.
On that note, that's all we have for questions for now. Thank you all very much.
All right. Well, I'll take it away from here. And I think, maybe just want to zoom out a little bit. We've been talking an awful lot about the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. Just going to talk about briefly that there are some other greenways in Brooklyn. So we've got two greenways on Ocean Parkway and Eastern Parkway that they're two of the oldest bicycle trails in the US. And then we've got a short stretch of greenway that's along Leif Ericson Park, which was originally cleared out to become a highway back in, I don't know, the 40s or 50s or so. And then that highway project got canceled and a park and a greenway got built there instead. And then, of course, there is the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. So I'll take this back to 2004 when BGI was formed. It could take it back to anywhere, to the Dinkins administration Greenway plan of '93, but I'll start with BGI starting in 2004. There was a bit of a focus, obviously, on Columbia Street and Northern Brooklyn. And part of the reason for that was that there was already a certain amount of Greenway that had already been built in Southern Brooklyn back in the 40s and the 50s with the Belt Parkway. You had 11 miles and 2 distinct sections. And there was a big gap in the middle, and there was nothing that went further north than Bay Ridge. So at that point, you got a couple of different plans over the next few years to address that gap. And one of them was led by the city administration, the city Department of City Planning. They did a study and they published a plan, Shore Parkway Greenway Connector Master Plan. And that entire focus was on closing the gap, the 4.5-mile gap between Bath Beach and Sheepshead Bay. And also, as we've been talking about, you've had a number of years of advocacy spurred on by BGI and other activists. As Jon talked about, Department of Transportation, you did the comprehensive study, published the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway Implementation Plan. That's where you detailed the routes, the rights-of-way, street design layouts. As Jon said, for 14 miles of the waterfront from Greenpoint to Sunset Park, that really set up the blueprint for how to get the Greenway done project by project. So if you skip ahead to today, the result of that has been there are now 10 new miles of Greenway along the Brooklyn waterfront where there used to be 11. So it's now 21 miles done out of 29. 8 of those miles were done in Northern Brooklyn, coming off the implementation plans blueprint. And the other 2 miles were done in Southern Brooklyn, basically close to a form that was envisioned by that Shore Parkway connector plan, and also with a little bit of a help, a little bit of a boost from the Jamaica Bay implementation plan that Jon referenced. And I also want to break down this a little bit in terms of, what are we considering a completed segment of Greenway? Because it really helps to think about how we want to look at the future segments of Greenway as they're getting done. So one of them, and this is really just in Brooklyn Bridge Park, a little bit of off-street park trail that managed to get done as part of the whole 29-mile project. That is, it's fully off the street grid. It's into the park. It has direct access to the waterfront. And that is for the park that runs by the bridge between Piers 1 and Piers 6. A lot of what was envisioned by that implementation plan was the grade separated and landscaped Greenway path. This is because a lot of the waterfront space and prospective park space in Brooklyn is already spoken for. And a lot of what the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and Northern Brooklyn in particular does is that it runs along the city street grid and connects park and waterfront destinations to each other rather than running directly on the waterfront itself. And that's a case where you see the streets being reconfigured to bring in this idea of that linear landscape path through the borough. So, in the photos that we're looking at here, you're looking at a sidewalk and a bike path that are at the same grade. They're separated from any moving cars or even separated from parked cars with trees, with plants, and with a raised curb. And here in the last 20 years and the 10 new miles, you'll see this sort of Greenway on the perimeter of the Brooklyn Navy Yard and on the perimeter of Brooklyn Army Terminal, and then further along into the Columbia waterfront on Van Brunt Street. These kinds of projects, these are the big ones. These are the capital projects that are expensive and take a lot of time, as Jon was talking about, maybe too much time, but that's worth when the opportunity is there, you get a really nice piece of Greenway and linear park out of it. And then the other part, as Jon was talking about, there's the protected 2-way bike path. It's the cheaper and the faster way to bring safe and comfortable biking infrastructure to a Greenway route. And bikes here are physically separated from moving traffic with either those concrete Jersey barriers or with parked cars. This picture that we're looking at here is from the ribbon cutting day at Emmons Avenue in Sheepshead Bay. And this particular method has also been applied on the Shore Parkway Service Road in Bath Beach and Gravesend, and also on Kent Avenue, north of the Navy Yard in Williamsburg. This is something where it brings the Greenway to a usable status. It really opens up the number of casual users that are able to use this. But on the same side, it's not necessarily that landscaped linear corridor that we'd like to see as the ideal. And even though this is a tool that's being used to complete the Greenway, it doesn't mean that the city can't go back in after the fact and put in, essentially upgrade it to that landscaped grade separated status. And that really is effectively what happened along the Navy Yard perimeter. The Greenway started off in its first few years as a protected bike lane there, and then eventually was upgraded through that capital project that took, several years of planning and funding and construction to get done. So with all of that, so it's now 21 miles out of 29 complete. What's in the pipeline? What's the prospects for getting those last 8 miles done? And I want to highlight a few projects that kind of lead into 4 miles of Greenway that we're pretty optimistic that these are in the pipeline. They're in construction, or they're in the pipeline to become construction, or they're very close to going into that pipeline. You've got basically 4 miles of Greenway segments that fall into that category, and we're optimistic that these are Greenway segments that can be opened up in the next few years. Not necessarily this year, in most cases not next year, but before we start calling out years with the words 2030, these 4 miles should definitely be set, we hope. So with that, I'll start with Hamilton Avenue and 3rd Avenue down to 29th Street. This is an example of something that's a Greenway project under construction. You wouldn't necessarily know that to look at it because it's tied into a lot of underground water utility work. And that work is what's really driving the length of the construction time that's needed here. Construction actually started in 2021. Part of the delay here is that a lot of these projects rely on underground survey work that isn't really proven right or wrong until they start construction and start digging. And then they find out it's right, or in this particular case, they found out that the surveys were wrong, and that ended up causing this project to have to go into further redesigns and further delays. The current estimate for now is completing this in early 2025. But I would say with all of these capital projects, every construction estimate comes with an asterisk because it can come with those sorts of delays that are not currently planned by the agencies that are building these out. But the short story here is that construction started, it will get done sooner or later, and we're excited about that. In Red Hook, there's another big chunk of this Greenway that is in the pipeline to go into construction in the next couple of years, and it's part of the broader coastal resiliency and coastal flood mitigation projects. In Red Hook, in particular, this was kicked off as a result of Hurricane Sandy, and this is a project that has been studied and been developed for an infrastructure project that is much, much bigger than just the Greenway itself. But the city government made it a point of incorporating the Greenway as part of this project so they don't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on something and then lock the Greenway project out of it and leave us figuring out how that's going to get done now that something else has been done in its place. Greenway project will be part of this, and it's nearing its final approval stages. I think it's past ULURP now for those people that are policy nerds about city land use. That's really the stage. It's gone past the borough president, and I think it's left to the city council at this point. The construction timeline right now is estimated for this to be done in 2028. And then in Sunset Park, there's a couple of bigger projects in Sunset Park, and then there's a couple of smaller projects. And 3 of them are essentially they're in the pipeline to begin and get finished. And then that fourth one is something that's just on the cusp of that. So I'll start with the northern part of Sunset Park. That's 29th to 39th Streets. There's a project that has been initiated. It's been designed, construction has been funded, and construction is going to take place. It's anticipated to happen throughout the course of next year and in 2026 and be complete at that point. So that, along with the Hamilton Avenue and 3rd Avenue project, and we'll bring that part of the Greenway all the way down to 39th Street, where there's a small, basically 1 or 2 block connector. It goes from 2nd Avenue to as close to the waterfront as it can go. That project is almost done, and it's effectively usable for being able to walk and bike on now, even though it's not, there's no ribbon that's been cut on that or anything like that. And then all the way down at the southern end of Sunset Park, there is the 58th Street connector between 1st and 2nd Avenues. That's something that had been reviewed and approved about 6 years ago, but that construction project was just held back for a period of time while they were working on other aspects of the Brooklyn Army Terminal retaining wall. So all those 3 projects, those are all essentially in the pipeline to get done in the next few years. And that kind of brings us to that first project that's not quite in that pipeline right now. So Sunset Park, the southern section between 39th Street and 58th Street. This schematic, this map that's in the bottom right of this this page, this is right out of the Brooklyn Waterfront implementation plan from 12 years ago. And you see that there's a number of corridors that the Waterfront Greenway could take through this section of Sunset Park. And we're kind of excited about the fact that all of these corridors are still open, they're still available, but right now DOT and EDC, the Economic Development Corporation, they're doing what they would refer to as a capital scoping project. And they're really, it's a little bit before they get to a point where they say, hey, here's a project that we want to design and we're going to have construction funding applied for it and we're going to get it done. It's essentially giving them the next stage blueprint of what they want to get done and what they want to accomplish here. We're excited about the fact that there's still an opportunity to align at least a part of this greenway closer to the waterfront than it is on just 1st Avenue. We'd be excited about the possibility of having a pathway that makes use of the current bicycle path that's on the Bush Terminal Piers Park. And I would say that there's no time frame here. There's a lot of enthusiasm by a bunch of different stakeholders, but this is also one of those cases where we're very keen to make sure that people that are supporters are being heard, and we're talking to other people that might not have thought about this, might have been invested in it, and we want to bring them along and bring them into a coalition of supporters for this overall project. So, we're again, I think we're a little more cautiously optimistic here, but we're excited about the possibilities here in Sunset Park. Moving along, Williamsburg is actually, this is another project where the last few blocks of Commercial Street, basically that opportunity got opened up by a residential construction project that finished a couple of years ago. And they had been blocking off the northern end of West Street while that construction project was taking place, and that's opened up now. It's really freed DOT to take a look at the design for finishing out what's already in the implementation plan. Right now they're planning on probably being in design for another year or two, with construction starting, hopefully, again with an asterisk, in 2026. And I think that brings us to the last 2 sections of the Greenway that have, they don't really have projects attached to them, or they don't have anything that's in the pipeline that would result in a completed Greenway. And the first one I'll talk about would be Dumbo and Vinegar Hill, because there actually are projects that are happening here they're not what we would consider something that would result in completing the gap in the Greenway between Brooklyn Bridge Park and say Navy Street or Sand Street. Those projects are to make it easier to bike on in traffic on the city streets. The DDC is essentially going in, they're adding these smooth slabs to act as bike lanes on cobblestone streets. And that makes it a little easier to bike on. You've seen a lot more of these pop up in Dumbo and Vinegar Hill over the past few years. And the expectation is that all the ones they plan to do will be done next year by the fall. So it's not really going to result in completed Greenway, but it is a project that is going to make the environment a little easier to bike on. And then the last gap, again, this is Coney Island and Brighton Beach. This old gap used to be 4.5 miles, and now it's a lot smaller. It's now to 2.5 miles. But there's not really anything that's in the pipeline that will definitely lead to construction. There's nothing that we feel particularly confident about saying, hey, this is definitely going to get done. This will get done when there's a coalition that effectively raises their voice and makes it known that this is a priority project. Right now, you have a number of painted bike lanes that span this 2.5 mile gap, but they are, for the most part, blocked almost all the time. Okay, and then moving away from the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway for a little bit, I know Hunter and John both talked about the citywide Greenway plan. So BGI was part of the New York City Greenways Coalition that was instrumental in getting the legislation passed by the City Council that's going to lead to that first new citywide Greenway plan since the Dinkins administration. And then in parallel to that project, instead of just waiting around for that plan to be done and then acting on it, what New York City DOT and Parks have been doing is that they have identified 6 corridors that they deem to be the early action corridors that they're going to be studying while this Greenway plan for the entire city is being developed. They're using the federal planning grant to do that. In many ways, it's very similar to the funding that Nydia Velasquez was able to get Brooklyn and BGI and the DOT to do the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway implementation plan. And that's really expected to be the outcome of these 6 studies. It should be 6 new implementation plans for all of these corridors that you see on the screen to act as a guidepost for future progress. And then the one that's going to be taking place in Brooklyn, they're deeming it the Historic Brooklyn study because it's focused on the existing greenways that were the oldest greenways, Ocean Parkway and Eastern Parkway. But they're also looking, in addition to bringing those 2 greenways up to a modern day standard, they're looking to extend that and connect Eastern Parkway to Broadway Junction and to Highland Park. I had mentioned before about the idea of taking those protected bike lanes and upgrading them to a higher form, like grade separated and landscaped. There's a couple of different initiatives. One is actually led by the city and has a little bit more of their buy-in, and the other one is led by grassroots activists that does not currently have any particular buy-in from city agencies, but certainly has enthusiasm and support from elected officials. The first one, it's in Southwest Brooklyn. It's Destination Greenways. This is a Parks-led project to upgrade the connections along that Leif Ericson Greenway corridor, and then along the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway facing Gravesend Bay, and hopefully lead to some better connections to Coney Island. I think the thing that I would highlight here is that this has been funded through, the parts on the west portion here, projects 1, 3, and 4. So Leif Ericson and the Bay Ridge Greenways have been funded, and construction, I think, is expected to be complete in 2027 or thereabouts. Again, it's something that has a long lead time and has some asterisks attached. The other projects that you see here, projects 5 through 10, these do not have any sort of funding attached to them. And until there is any sort of allocation, it would have to be either directly from the mayor's member items or the borough president or the council members until there is any sort of funding allocation. It's a little bit like a fairyland project. So it's another one of those things that we would like to build a coalition for and get support for so it can actually happen. And then the other project, and I think John alluded to this a little bit, is taking the Kent Avenue section. And this is an initiative of grassroots activists in Williamsburg and Greenpoint, and really making a point of upgrading a space that has become one of the busiest used sections of Greenway or bike infrastructure anywhere, and increasing the amount of space that's available both for bikes and pedestrians. This was the bit that I wanted to come back to. There was from the Q&A that we had a little bit earlier. So there are some maintenance challenges for the greenways that come in a few different categories. And a lot of it stems from the fact that there's a bit of a mismatch because there are different agencies that manage different sections of greenways. Those agencies are good at their primary function, and they're not as good at the functions that they're not supposed to be doing. So as an example, with the surface quality of some of the parks greenways, the Parks Department really struggles from the fact that they've got some long-term institutional challenges. It's an agency that really hasn't recovered from the 1970s financial collapse of the government. It's not an agency that's recovered from before the city dropped dead. So with that in mind, when they have things that are not plantings, they're not green things, it's not really in their wheelhouse, they don't have a good process for having funding available to do small repairs, and those kinds of issues turn into bigger problems that need long-term capital reconstruction. And they don't really have a good mechanism for getting funding for those sorts of projects. Again, those are all coming as member items from the city council member or the borough president. And when those projects do happen, they tend to take a long time. One of the pictures here is from the Ocean Parkway, from a 4-block section of the Greenway there that has been closed for most of the year. Whereas a typical New York City DOT resurfacing project, it's pretty straightforward. The amount of time that it takes to do is all baked into the time it's allowed between milling and resurfacing, and it doesn't really take that long. Same thing in reverse for New York City DOT. They've got a lot of those brand new greenways that are on street, and they've got, there's a lot of landscaping that's on those greenways that are not in the transportation department's wheelhouse. They definitely recognize that this is a challenge, and I think they've been trying to address it. And I think they're expecting to be able to tend to these areas at least one more time this year than they did last year. They've identified a possible approach for the long term, especially as they make more of these greenways and all of the other boroughs. But they're still continuing to face those year-to-year funding challenges because it's essentially not a typical transportation department function. And I think getting back to that question that we had at the beginning here, it's also when there are issues with debris or garbage collection, there's a certain amount of this that happens within the Parks Department or within rights of way that the Sanitation Department manages for streets that aren't necessarily getting applied to greenways. That said, there actually is a fair amount of partnership with sanitation between them and DOT on snow removal and ice maintenance. Again, parks, just because of the structural challenges their agency faces, they're still having difficulties with resources and funding there. I just want to wrap it up, and I apologize if this took a little bit of time, but we want everyone that's listened to us talk about this. We would love to get you involved in the projects that build support and build those coalitions and help make sure that those pipeline projects get all the way through to completion, and those projects that are still not in the pipeline, getting them into the pipeline so we can have a completed 29-mile Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, so we can have a fully connected Eastern Parkway to Broadway Junction in Highland Park. We definitely would encourage you to sign up to our newsletter or follow us on social media, because as there are things that happen, like if there are community meetings, if there are government officials to write, whether they're in their agencies or they're elected officials, whether there's rallies to attend, newsletter and social media, that's how we're going to let you know that those are happening and how to turn out to them. And we definitely would encourage you to attend one of the events that we have coming up. You know, in the spring, in the summer and fall, our events calendar, it's always got something from the Naval Cemetery landscape, and we frequently have events that are happening on the Waterfront Greenway as well. Right now we have an Earth Day event planned at the NCL for April 20th. And we have a couple of family bike rides planned for this spring, one in Bay Ridge and another one in Canarsie. And there's also the BGI fundraiser that's coming up in June, and there's going to be more to come for the rest of the summer and the fall. And I'm also just going to highlight a couple of things for the New York City Greenways Coalition. In Queens, a couple of Saturdays from now, there's going to be a bike ride that is going to be touring the prospective area for one of those early action corridors on the Queens waterfront. And then in the Bronx, also in April, the first couple of weeks, the DOT study, they're doing their second round of workshops. They did a couple of them in person in March, and these two that you see here, these are going to be virtual workshops that you can connect to on, I don't know if it's going to be Zoom or Microsoft Teams, but you'll be able to connect to them virtually, and DOT is definitely encouraging people to turn out for those.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. That was really informative and engaging, and we have one question in the chat so far, and I know we're at time, but if anyone else has any questions, we can try to stay a little. So we have one question here. To what extent can other transit and mobility efforts be helpful for pushing the greenways toward completion? I'm thinking about last mile delivery by bike and e-bike, blue highway re-engagement of the waterfront, commuter and recreational ferries, etc.
Mm-hmm. I think it certainly can be helpful. I think that the DOT in particular, and also the EDC, the city agencies that are primarily involved for economic activity on the waterfront, can be helpful for shaping how things are thought about in terms of connecting those, say, those blue highways to say those last mile connections on bike infrastructure. I would say that obviously there's also a certain amount of activism that can be done on individual and group level, but I do think DOT and EDC, to a certain extent, they've got some things in mind and would definitely like some help from community members to support those initiatives.
I mean, I think all those things that bring more activity to the waterfront certainly bring more demand for the greenways. And there's good synergy already, for example, between like the ferry pier in Greenpoint or the ferry pier in Bay Ridge and the greenways there. It makes it easy to get on and off, either get to the boat, get off the boat and go somewhere else. But that doesn't mean you get more money to build the greenway. So we still just need to push on the city to develop a bigger program. The one thing I think that is going on that could help in the long run, but could also be problematic, and we need to really keep an eye on it, is this long-range Army Corps study of the waterfronts in New York from a climate, adaptation point of view, where, people have kind of rejected what they came up with first because it's all seawalls and, like very scary pictures of like the Greenway and, on the west side of Manhattan stuck behind a 10-foot concrete wall. And they've even built some of that kind of thing over on the east side of Manhattan in the 1920s, where they're, doing some water, basically some anti-flooding waterfront work now. But that could bring a lot of money at some point to the waterfronts, and we should be at the table and making sure that the waterfronts are greenways that are resilient greenways.
And if you have a couple more, if people start writing in questions as we close out, I can take note of them and try to send answers later on. But yeah, Brian, I'll pass it to you to close us out.
Actually, I just saw a couple of questions pop into the chat, so maybe
I got it. Sorry.
no problem.
I'm excited about the possibility of attracting our members to the green infrastructure cause. Maybe a continuing ed webinar for us. Maybe an event you host that we could promote. Somebody reach out to me, and then he shares his information.
Okay. Yeah, that could be something that we do. I'm enthusiastic that people are excited about listening to this sort of program. At the end of the day, we definitely want people to get excited about the Greenway and excited about reaching out to elected officials and city agencies and everything along that, and being out on the Greenway, visibly engaged with the Greenway, and letting your friends and neighbors and your colleagues know that it's there and where things are, so that we're spreading the word about what's there and what needs to be done. Did you still want me to close it out, or
Up to you.
Yeah, actually, Hunter, I don't know if you want to have any closing remarks, but I personally want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening to what we have to say, and we definitely hope to see you out on the Greenway.
Yeah, thank you, Brian and Rob, John, and Sam, and everyone who joined tonight. I love the idea of doing community or continuing education with the AIA and other groups. So please, follow us. As I said earlier, help spread the word about everything that's happening with Greenways in New York City. Come meet the team on April 20th. That'll be a great chance to see how people use the Greenway and really get even more detailed on our work. So hope to see you at one of our upcoming events. And thanks again for joining.